Okay, guys, on my last video, I mentioned how I wanted to make a video on what UFC cards to invest in. And I'm, oh, geez, I'm so slack on this channel. But I've been watching. There aren't many channels on YouTube or videos on YouTube that have content on UFC cards. Out there, and the few ones that I have seen when they talk about investing in UFC cards, they always mention at the top of their list, second to none, is Conor McGregor, who's obviously, a big superstar, and there's no doubt about it, he is the biggest star in mixed martial arts, and he's one of the biggest athletes or biggest star athletes in the world. He's impressive wins over Jose Aldo and then over Eddie Alvarez, winning those championships in two different divisions and being the first one to do it have been absolutely amazing. But he's absolutely on a downward slope. And ever since post the Eddie Alvarez fight, it's been heavy business decision choices over who he fights. So for Floyd Mayweather, for example, was a big cash opportunity, and who could blame him? It's just like, well, I'll have a crack at fighting the best boxer of all time and earn millions of dollars from it. I don't blame him. And then he's very casual with the UFC, and he's come back and he's just been on a downward slope. And anyone who saw him when he versed Cowboy Cerrone, that was, if you didn't pick Conor McGregor to beat Cowboy Cerrone before that fight, oh man, you must be crazy. And then it was another business decision to fight Dustin Poirier, a fighter that Conor McGregor has beaten before. And I think they really thought they were going to run through him, and he didn't realize at all how much the division has changed, how hard all the top 10 fighters have been fighting each other, and how much the game has evolved, and Conor McGregor hasn't. And also, Conor McGregor's attitude outside of the ring and also in the octagon or outside of the octagon has been very, very vile. And I understand as much as he attracts people, he as much as he repels people, he'll attract as much. And Conor McGregor has a very, very fanatical fan base, I'll just put it lightly, like almost to the point of delusion. But getting back to what this video is about, they're talking about UFC cards as an investment. And in those videos, they always highlight as their number one choice Conor McGregor, and I disagree with that. Maybe short term, in a couple of years, Conor McGregor is probably good to buy and sell, maybe even less than that, but I can't see his stock going up. Like maybe if he gets a Jake Paul fight, he'll be more renowned. But in regards, if he fights the Paul brothers, or if he gets a fight with Manny Pacquiao, his star will still be relevant, and he has opportunities to fight Dustin Poirier a fourth time, which I really doubt he has any chance of winning. Nick Diaz 3, or try to take a safer risk sort of thing. It's still going to be a risk, but a safer sort of fight against Tony Ferguson. But I don't see Conor McGregor ever again being in a title contention. I just don't see it happening. And those fighters fighting each other in his division, what Conor McGregor is renowned for is his counterpunching and his power. And his power just hasn't carried with him in the lightweight division. You can always talk about Eddie Alvarez, but Khabib mentioned it in his fight, and so did Dustin Poirier. They both got tagged with a left hand by Conor, maybe not his best shot, and then they felt, oh, it's not that bad. And that really tells me Conor McGregor's power hasn't carried well, because often when a fighter goes up a division, their power often doesn't translate well unless you're Manny Pacquiao. Sort of like a Roberto Duran. Roberto Duran was phenomenal lightweight, and then when he went up to welterweight, middleweight, his power just wasn't there, so he had to rely on skill. Conor McGregor, his power hasn't translated well, and his skill is very, very one-dimensional. So we got to start discussing his legacy in the UFC, and it isn't a good one. The first double champ, but he has never, ever defended his belt. He is more of a star than he is as a greatest of all time fighter. And I want to give an example of a fighter here. Tito Ortiz. For those of you guys not familiar with Tito, he was the UFC for the longest time, right before Ultimate Fighter, the series, came on and really helped UFC, launch as a super sport, Tito Ortiz really carried UFC for a while, and he was like, and that's his nickname, the bad boy, the Huntington Beach bad boy of the UFC. He wasn't as vile as Conor McGregor. Conor McGregor, is threatening death threats against Dustin Poirier and his family, is insulting Dustin's wife. He said awful things about religion to Khabib and awful things about Khabib's father. He's very, very vile in terms of his I guess if you want to say pre-fight promotion. And the biggest card that everyone pulls with Conor McGregor, his fan base defenders, they'll always say, oh, it's just business. But he's very, very vile in terms of how he carries himself. Tito Ortiz was never like that, but he was the bad boy of UFC. He had a rivalry with Vitor Belfort, specifically, of course, Chuck Liddell, a famous rivalry with Chuck Liddell, and Randy Couture. But Tito Ortiz did win the light heavyweight championship, and he defended it 5 times. And I want to emphasize how important it is when a champion wins a belt and they defend it, because Matt Hughes famously said it's one thing to win a championship belt, and it's a whole other thing to defend it. And Tito Ortiz, to his credit, did it 5 times. In my opinion, despite not having 2 belts in 2 separate weight divisions, Tito Ortiz is has a much better resume than Conor McGregor in terms of MMA, not in terms of stardom. Conor McGregor is a huge star, eclipses everyone that's come before him. And the other positive thing, sorry, I'll just quickly sidetrack here. The other positive thing with Conor McGregor is how much money he brought into the UFC, and the reason why Khabib or Dustin Poirier are able to get these multi-million dollar deals is because of Conor McGregor. There's no disputing that, because of his ferocious mentality in the octagon and outside the octagon. He got a lot of eyes on the sport, and his oppositions, Khabib and Dustin Poirier, have really got a lot of money because of that. So that's one of the things the Conor McGregor defenders will say, and that they're absolutely right in that. Because of him, pay is sort of increased for a lot of fighters. So Tito Ortiz, in my opinion, as it stands, if Conor McGregor was to retire now, he has, in my opinion, Tito Ortiz has a much better resume because he defended the belt for so long. He has fought against many all-time greats. Tito Ortiz, Chuck Liddell, Frank Shamrock, I guess Ken Shamrock, if you want to include that, Randy Couture, and a whole bunch of others. I'm forgetting the Brazilians' name he fought. Machida, I think. Oh, geez, I'm blanking on names here. Wanderlei Silva. So Tito Ortiz, I think, look, I loved Tito Ortiz back in the day. He was one of my favorite fighters, and I think he was great for the sport back in the day. He really carried it, but he's sort of turned into obscurity now. And his cards aren't worth that much. So as an investment, people wouldn't even consider Tito Ortiz as a good investment card. And I feel Conor McGregor will eventually, his stock will just keep dipping and dipping, especially with how bad and how vile his outside of the octagon antics are. The awful stuff he tweets about Khabib's father, about Dustin Poirier's wife. And I do have friends that don't know much about MMA, and when I mentioned Conor McGregor, they said, oh, that guy who punched that old guy in the pub, and I can't see Conor McGregor not having more issues like that outside of the octagon. He just seems like a really wild guy, and if those things keep occurring, like I'll get to Jon Jones in a second, but I can't see his stock going high. I can just see it going low and low. But at the moment, Conor McGregor cards, granted, it's still high. If you buy and you can flip, I would advise, not holding Conor McGregor long term, because remember Tito Ortiz, he was the bad boy of UFC, and as time has marched on, he's sort of fallen into obscurity, unfortunately, and he's fallen into obscurity even with MMA fans like myself, and he was my favorite. I still love to get Tito Ortiz cards, but I wouldn't pay top dollar for them, and I wouldn't see it as a big investment. But yeah, still no doubt Conor McGregor is probably the second biggest selling cards in terms of investment and flipping, because he's only recently been beaten. I think the highest at the moment is Khabib Nurmagomedov, with one of his cards selling really recently, like in this week, for $40,000 or $50,000 US or $47,000 US, which is incredible for a UFC card to get that high. So I think the market is sort of correcting, or rather the people are realizing how valuable Khabib is as an all-time great. And you look at his resume, Khabib has retired. He is pretty much locked in. Like, he was offered $100 million to fight Floyd Mayweather in a boxing match, and he turned it down. So I can't see him coming back to the UFC to fight again. So as an investment, I think Khabib is better long-term over Conor McGregor, because his resume speaks for itself. He is the greatest of all time. He is undefeated. One of the greatest of all time. I don't think he is the greatest of all time. He is undefeated. He's won all his fights in dominant fashion, and he seems to carry himself in a really, really respectable way. There is no danger of him doing really awful things outside of the octagon. The other guy, so the top three, I would argue, to invest in, it would be Jon Jones, Khabib, and George St Pierre. Now, George St Pierre, I've got a better photo here. George St Pierre is locked in as well. He's retired, and he's only had one loss on his resume. That was to Matt Serra, which he later avenged. And he's a very, very respectable guy outside of the octagon. The only knock with George St Pierre is that, and he had a great run as well, but the only knock against him is that his fights were pretty bland. Like, in contrast to Conor McGregor, where all of Conor's fights have been absolutely spectacular. They've been such a great hype to watch. Like, the build-up has been so great. He generates so much hype. And the events itself, I can't name one boring Conor McGregor fight. It's pretty outstanding. He's really, really interesting to watch. Whereas George St Pierre, he really cracked the code of mixed martial arts, and he showcased it in such a great way against a great wrestler like a Jake Shields or a Diego Sanchez, or a good wrestler, I should say. He just jabbed them to death, and they were so boring, those fights, and so dominant. And then if it was a good striker like a Nick Diaz or Dan Hardy, he would take it to the ground. And I remember talking up a storm, George St Pierre is so awesome, and having people who don't know much about mixed martial arts over my house watching the UFC, and they were getting so bored. You know what I mean? Like, so the George St Pierre era is what I grew up coming back into watching MMA, Matt Hughes and Tito Ortiz and all the rest of it. And unfortunately, it wasn't a very spectacular, exciting run. And that's nothing. It really pains me to say that with George St Pierre. I've got his book. I've got his T-shirts. I'm a huge fan. But that's my knock against him. It's just not that X factor with him. But he is one of the greatest of all times. I reckon number two and number three being Khabib, and I'll get to number one in a second. But that's my only knock against George St Pierre. He just doesn't have that X factor. But in terms of card investment, I think it's a good thing. Getting George St Pierre cards. I can't see it going down. I can't see him coming back. Like, there is talks of him coming back to fight Khabib. I think that's long gone now. But that was a strong possibility, them two fighting each other. So yeah, but George St Pierre, wonderful person, and a very spectacular UFC record, and definitely one of the greatest of all time. So, and he's known in Asia, he's known all around the world, and he's in movies now. So I think it's a safe bet if you want to invest in George St Pierre cards. Oh, George St Pierre again, sorry. And the other guy is Jon Jones, who I think is the best MMA fighter in the world. Now, as an investment, there is a bit of a worry with Jon Jones. Jon Jones, outside of the octagon, is full of ups and downs. He's been out of the octagon for ages for drug use, the cheating scandal, where I think it was a no contest against Daniel Cormier. When he faced Daniel Cormier, he tested positive for a drug substance. He had a hit and run incident, and he just has a lot of negative things that have happened outside of the octagon in his life, which has affected his image. And he's still youngish. I think he's still got a bit to go in the UFC. He's recently moved up to heavyweight, but a pay dispute or something like that, and he's pulled out. He might become a Demetrius Johnson. So Demetrius Johnson is considered the greatest, I don't know, bantamweight, flyweight. I can't remember his division, what weight he's at, sorry. And then he left UFC and everyone's forgotten about him. No one talks about him, and he had a massive loss and won at one championships, I think, or I don't think it was Bellator. I think it was one. And so that could be the case with Jon Jones. If Jon Jones leaves and goes to Bellator or one championship, say they offer him an unbelievable amount of money, watch what happens to Jon Jones' stock. He will disappear off the UFC radar. He will never be ranked in an MMA in a pound for pound list. And if that happens, my opinion won't change. Jon Jones, I still consider the greatest mixed martial artist of all time at the moment. Now, so despite him being number one, he isn't locked in. So I can't advise getting Jon Jones cards as an investment because of that. What will happen? Will he fight in the heavyweight division? How he will go? What will Jon Jones do? He's sort of wild outside of the octagon. You know, there's too many variables and risks with Jon Jones, although I do, in my opinion, think that he is the best mixed martial artist of all time. There is also another one. Oh, jeez, I can't feel there. There is also another one with Anderson Silva. I see Anderson Silva mentioned a bit as well in the greatest of all time collecting cards. And the Anderson Silva era. Whoa, what an era. He was Superfly. He was, oh my gosh, this guy was incredible. Unfortunately, and it's interesting, the parallel I'm going to bring up here, that with Roy Jones Jr., who Anderson Silva is actually one of his heroes. There's talks of him possibly fighting Roy Jones Jr. in an exhibition match, but Anderson Silva loves Roy Jones Jr. It's one of his biggest heroes. Roy Jones Jr. at his time was phenomenal, was an absolute phenom, and then he got knocked out. He went up a weight division to heavyweight, went back down to light heavyweight, and that really messed him up. Like, his reaction time and his pace really slowed, and he became very vulnerable. He was like Achilles, back in the day. He was absolutely Superfly and phenomenal. Same thing with Anderson Silva, eerily. He was Superfly, he was unbeatable. And then he got he went for a leg kick against Chris Weidman, broke his leg, and he's never been the same. It's been loss after loss after that, and those losses have stayed in everyone's minds. In my opinion, I reckon he'll always be in the top pound for pound list as the greatest of all time. But the way he ended his career really sticks with people. There is a saying at work, you're only as good as your last day. Personally, I think they just invented that saying so you don't start screwing around before you leave your job if you got redundant or whatever. But I think it's true in mixed martial arts. People, as spectacular as some of Anderson Silva's wins have been, people equally remember his brutal leg kick loss to Chris Weidman. So I don't think Anderson Silva is the best to invest in, although I love Anderson Silva. Whereas George St Pierre is, he retired on top. He's sort of locked in. And Khabib retired on top. He's locked in. So what I look for when I invest in cards, and I was 200% correct about Khabib. I couldn't believe, again, in that video, you can watch my Khabib Nurmagomedov collection. I go on and on about how cheap Khabib Nurmagomedov cards were, and I'm just, I'm still surprised, like, how fast his cards have risen, like the last sale being $47,000 or $50,000 US. But I'm right. I was right. I was absolutely right that Khabib was going to go through the roof. So just calling it now in this video, I think probably George St Pierre is probably the next best thing, because you want to look for guys that are locked in, sort of thing. And the big question mark, obviously, Jon Jones. If you can get Jon Jones cheap, it's great. So I'm a Michael Jordan collector, and I always try to find who is the Michael Jordan of their sport. That's one easier route to find out who's the best to invest in. But Michael Jordan is really something special, guys. Like, he's a once in a lifetime athlete, and he's got his own clothing brand, which is something that's, huge in itself. That's something that's a whole other discussion that I can't even really verbalize. That clothing brand isn't just, oh yeah, I sell George St Pierre shirts, you know what I mean, or with Affliction. It isn't like that. The Jordan brand, that icon of Michael Jordan dunking, is so massive. It is a fashionable thing. People wait in line for the next collector edition of his shoes. Like, the Jordan name and brand is beyond the sport. Michael Jordan transcends his sport. So I don't think there is a Michael Jordan of UFC yet. There hasn't been someone that has risen through, been the greatest of all time, and had their own, I don't know, branding, massive branding that's so iconic. People will argue Conor McGregor's whiskey. I don't agree with that. Not compared to Michael Jordan. And you got to remember, UFC's a young sport. We're still in the infancy stages of it. So there will be a hero that will rise, a fighter, sorry, there will be a hero that will rise. There will be a fighter that will rise up and become the Michael Jordan of the sport. It's just not here yet. And people arguing Conor McGregor is that, I disagree. I think short term, yeah, but long term, you're going to see the greatest of all times that will rise to the top. Yeah. Just quickly, I don't think Jon Jones will be the Michael Jordan of MMA just because of his outside the court antics. I know Michael Jordan, social media wasn't massive back in Jordan's day, and Michael Jordan, from that documentary, The Last Dance, it was revealed how much of a bully Michael Jordan was to his teammates, how he'd punch him and stuff like that, and he had not necessarily a gambling problem. I don't think he had a gambling problem at all, but he loved to gamble. The reason why people say it's a gambling problem because of the amount of money Michael Jordan would gamble, but $10,000 to him is like $1. You know what I mean? Like, he's so massive. But if social media was around, I don't know, maybe a lot of his outside antics would have been really outside court attitudes would have been really amplified, and I don't know, cancel culture might have been a thing back then, but. Definitely in this day and age, if you sneeze, it's on social media and people will see it. And Jon Jones, unfortunately for him, a lot of his outside antics have been really highlighted. I don't think he's a nice person, and that's why it's always questionable whether to invest in him as a card, because you could buy all his best rookies and stuff like that, but then. Next week he could be getting banned from the sport, and that would really drop his stock. Because at the moment, Jon Jones actually isn't fighting. He vacated the light heavyweight belt, and he's going to fight Francis Ngannou or Derek Lewis, or there's talks of him fighting those guys. But he's pulled out at the moment. I think it's a pay dispute, or maybe he's just waiting to see what will happen. I'm not sure. So very questionable. Over what's going to happen with Jon Jones. So yeah, so that's my take on which UFC cards to invest with. But again, have fun with UFC. Collect your favorite fighters. Hell, I love Chris Lytle. The Lights Out Lytle. He was one of my favorites. I'm so happy to get this. This is my favorite Daniel Cormier card. Like, oh my gosh, look how cool it is. I love Tito Ortiz back in the day. You know what I mean? Have fun with it. I know there's a lot of people looking to invest. Take your safe bets if you're looking to invest. Go Khabib, go George St Pierre, go sealed product, and you'll be fine. But otherwise, just collect your favorite fighters, because I don't think I still think the price for UFC cards are pretty cheap when you compare it to Michael Jordan. All right, thanks a lot, guys.